The Blak Sovereign Movement has its roots in the 1970s, but earlier this year it burst into the national spotlight when Independent Senator Lydia Thorpe split from the Greens.
Sovereignty has never been ceded.
The voice squarely in its sights.
We are saying no to the referendum and no to the voice.
The movement includes First Nations elders, activists, academics and community workers.
We are being asked to recognise the legitimacy of the white constitution, and in the most meaningless way.
What the Blak Sovereign Movement is doing right now, it is reminding us of who we are and where we come from. It's grounded in a long tradition of Indigenous activism.
Supporters of the movement include academic and writer Chelsea Wadago, who says that the voice, as an advisory body to the Parliament, would be powerless.
I resent the fact that settlers get to decide what is in our best interests. I mean, you don't have to be a historian to know that that as a strategy has failed us as a people. And I think there's something to be said about maintaining the rage.
At the heart of their argument is that Aboriginal sovereignty comes first.
On the one hand, the institutions of white Australia say we are the only sovereign and we decide what rights Aboriginal people have got. The Aboriginal sovereignty movement says, I don't think so.
In Australia, there are differing views on the concept of sovereignty, according to constitutional law expert Anne Toomey.
Sovereignty has been contested in Australia, and part of the problem is that we use the term differently and at cross purposes. So we can talk about legal sovereignty, which is what the High Court's talked about, and that is the British coming in and now popular sovereignty of the Australian people. We can also talk about political sovereignty, and there we mean things like self-determination, so an ability of a group of people within Australia to have more control over their own lives. And we can talk also about spiritual sovereignty and Indigenous sovereignty.
The Uluru Statement describes sovereignty as a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples.
The Uluru Statement of the Heart makes that quite clear as well in saying that the two coexist. So it expressly says that Indigenous sovereignty, that spiritual relationship with land, coexists with sovereignty of the Crown. And that's because they are essentially two different things that can live together.
The statement goes on to call for a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations. In other words, treaty. Makarrata means coming together after a struggle.
At international law, a treaty is an agreement between two sovereign states, and you see them with the UN and those sorts of things. But you can also have treaties within a nation, between the government itself and often Indigenous peoples.
While the Uluru Statement calls for a voice first, some no advocates from the Blak Sovereign Movement want to skip the voice and go straight to treaty.
Look, the voice is just such a weak proposition.
The struggle for Aboriginal land rights is a struggle all over the country. And
lawyer and activist Michael Mansell has long fought for Aboriginal rights and says only treaty can empower First Nations peoples.
A treaty confers rights on Aboriginal people and imposes obligations on all governments. A voice does not confer any rights and doesn't impose any obligations.
Give the call to the Minister for Indigenous Australians.
The Albanese government has committed to the Uluru Statement in full, with the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Linda Burney, clarifying when the government might act on Makarrata.
Progress on Makarrata will not occur until after the referendum. Our priority is constitutional recognition through a voice.
But during the voice debate, the Prime Minister has appeared to deflect questions on the Commonwealth's role.
Can we just get from you, what is your approach to treaty? Where does it sit in your priorities as Prime Minister?
Well, my priority is the referendum. That's my priority. But treaty, of course, are being advanced in different places.
But at a Commonwealth level?
Back in treaty is occurring. There's 400 Indigenous nations in this country. So we're not talking about centralised operations here.
For Indigenous Australians who are...
Prominent No campaigner Warren Mundine backs treaties and has suggested a successful No outcome might lead to discussions on treaty.
So we're more likely to get treaties if people vote no?
Yeah, because then we have to do the hard... On the 15th of October, if it's a no vote, that's when the real work starts.
Blak Sovereign Movement supporter Michael Mansell has told 730 the movement will push the Prime Minister for a treaty if Australia votes against the referendum.
People like me and others are going to go to Albanese and say, all right, you lost the referendum. You agreed with the Uluru Statement, which includes treaty and truth-telling. You've set aside money for it. We now want that treaty convention in February, March 2024. Now, he is going to have to say, all right, I agree.
Whichever way the referendum goes, state-based treaties with First Nations peoples are already on their way. Queensland has a bipartisan path to treaty, which will set up a First Nations Treaty Institute to advance the treaty process. In New South Wales, the government has committed $5 million to a 12-month consultation process. The ACT has funded early talks, while Tasmania has set up an Aboriginal advisory body. The Northern Territory has a treaty unit. South Australia's State Voice will be elected next year as it works towards one too. Western Australia has no treaty process, but a native title agreement with the Noongar people is sometimes referred to as Australia's first treaty. While Victoria is the most advanced, with its own state voice and negotiations about to begin.
We've never ceded our sovereignty, and that's not up for negotiation.
Negara Murray is a co-chair of Victoria's version of The Voice, the democratically elected First Peoples Assembly.
It's made up of 32 traditional owners of country that have come together to represent not only just traditional owners in Victoria, but all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that live here in this state.
I want to thank the Jara for having us here today on their country.
Next year, the Assembly will enter negotiations with the Victorian Government for a statewide treaty, and then multiple individual treaties with First Nations groups around Victoria.
It's a huge piece of work which includes health, education, justice, land rights, water rights, cultural heritage, language, so all of that. And as we've said, nothing is off the table.
In Queensland, former Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner Mick Gooder is helping lead that state's treaty process. Mick Gooder argues a yes vote is a pragmatic choice towards treaty.
I'll say this to those opposing the voice. We've put up a way of addressing the issues that confront us. Good on you for getting out there fighting the fight, but at the end of the day, the pragmatists are going to be sitting down across the table working this out.
I want to be remembered in my time, not for asking for less, but for fighting for more. And as blackfellas, we have every right to do that. And regardless of the outcome on the 14th of October, blackfellas will continue to fight.